Hey everyone, what is up? Welcome to this episode of My Coding School. And this episode is going to be kind of a continuation of the first episode about how to integrate Firestore into an application. This is going to be a more complex, what the difference between get doc and get docs, get set doc, add doc, do some basic queries, and how you should format some data moving forward. So let's get started. In this application, you can see that I added back the original login screen that we had from a previous video, along with the add data, read data, users section. So I just added it back here, and you'll see that why in a second. When you're working with adding items to the Firestore database, once you add the items there, most of the time you want to be able to query on something specific, and that something specific will be your user ID. And the only time you have a user ID is when you log into an application through either Auth0, Firestore, whatever it may be, or maybe you could create one locally. But the one I want to reference is the user's user ID, and you can see user UID right here for Tim at My Coding School's B8. It's just a UID that they could reference throughout the application. And that's important because we could actually use this to link this user with database entries that they've created, or a user that they have access to, and only they have access to. And it's a good example of how to use queries, so it's something to query on as well. But you can't use that user ID if you're not logged in. So that's why I put this login thing back here. So first step we're going to do is log in. And then once you do log in, even if we're not doing anything, you can see what just logged down here. UID is that same BHINAI. You could store it locally, but Firebase SDK actually does that for you. And you can see this is why we're actually adding in the auth object again. Once we've logged in, it stores it within the device, but through the Firebase SDK instead of having to manually do it. Like I said, you can do it yourself. You could store it in this component, like on login, store UID, but you actually have access to it. If you import the auth, you get auth. Same thing we did in login. If you haven't seen that one, there's another video for login. You could do auth.currentUser, so that's my user that I'm logged in as, and then UID. There's a few other things on this current user, which actually, you know what? Let's check that out. So let's do console.log auth.current user, and that way we can actually see what we have access to. So if we call read data, we can see we have an access token, refresh token, expiration time, and tenant ID is undefined, and UID is right here. Oh, here's what I was looking for. So there's also display name, when it was created at, the email. You can see my email, tim@mycodingschool.com. If that email was verified, false, anonymous, false, last login, phone number, photo URL. And you could update some of these too manually, but that'll be for a different video. But just to show where we're getting this from, and if we do current user.user ID, click read again, and that's the user ID that we have access to because we've logged in. So with that, we're going to use it to query a few things. But first, we're going to go over the difference between get docs and get documents. So in our previous episode, we created a few documents with add doc, and every single time we click add doc, it'll add a new user, even though it's the same information, same company. I did add two new things. We have UID, which is what we just talked about, auth.currentUser.UID, and we have this server timestamp, which is from Firebase. And I like to use this when you're creating a user or creating a new transaction or updating something, so that in the future there's a lot of scenarios where you want to get all of the users that were created over the last week, or get all the transactions that you made with this credit card over the last month type of thing. And you could do that by using a query and querying this created at or updated at key. And to go back to where we added a few different, we have 4 different items in this users table. A lot of them have the same information. This is the very first one we put. Then we added last name M, and then we added UID and created that. So in the real world, I'm not going to want to add a new user to this every single time I click add data. So we can even do it again. Let's add data, and we'll add in another one. That's not really what you want to do. What you want to do is, okay, I've created this person one time, name, Tim, company, my coding school, and user ID. You'd even see they have the same user ID. So instead, what you want to do is like, okay, well, maybe I'm updating my name to Tim M. Instead of creating a new one, you're going to want to update or set a document so it just updates with the current information. And the way we do that is set doc. And in this scenario, we're actually going to create a new one, yet another one, but we're going to create it with a key of current user.userid. All of these keys were created automatically with add doc. With set doc, you have to pass in the key that you want to use to create. So this can be a string. You could be whatever you want, but for this scenario, we're going to create UID because this user, we only wanted to have access to the person logged in. So we're going to save that and click add data again. And we can see it's a different, this one makes it easy because we could actually see the difference in the user ID. So we could see, okay, the same information's here, Tim M, my coding school, created at UID. But if we keep clicking it like we were before, let's say we're gonna add last name key instead with Tim M, and then we're just going to keep the first name, so this is a good example, and we're going to click add data again. So instead of adding yet another document, it's just going to update what's currently there. So we can even click it again, and if you scroll over real quick, we can see the yellow, so that means it's updating versus before when we did add doc, it was green, it was adding a new one every single time. And so, no, I don't want to save that page. And so that's the difference between set doc and add doc. Most of the time you're going to want to add set doc for like user specific things. But let's say there's a bunch of credit card transactions. You don't really want to put the user ID for every one. So you would want to use add doc. So just to know the difference between those two. Now to querying. Once we query items, there's 2 different ways we could do it. Actually, there's a lot more than 2, but we're going to cover 2 right here. We're going to stick with the get docs method that we used before in the query, and then the same user ref that we're using for it. So collection, database, users, and we're going to add this where clause. So you need to import this where from Firestore. So just like you would in SQL, where something equals something else, you have access to that in Firestore as well. It's not, you can't do really complex joins, like I said before, or complex queries, but for simple things like this, it works great. And so the format is, we want to query this UID field. So how this one's working, it's like, okay, in all of these docs, if it has a field of UID, I want to return each one of those. So in this scenario, it's going to return 1, 2, 3, 4. 4 items, because 4 items have a UID of BHIN, blah, blah, blah. And then we're going to do the same thing. We're going to snapshot. We're going to go through each one. We're going to push it to an array that we have this time, and then we're going to update the user. Actually, let's come back to this one. After this, we're going to log what this array has, because we know it's going to have 4 items, but let's just see what it has locally. So we have this array, company, Tim, UID, 1, 2, 3, 4. So we got 4 items. In the real world, though, we're not going to want we don't want 4 users. We just want the one main user. And we could do that with get doc. But get doc, we have to know what the document key is, and that's here. So we have all of these keys that were automatically created. We don't really have a reference to what that is, so we can't get that one individually. The only one we do know is the one where we specifically set the key with set doc, and we set it to the UID. So that allows us to, let's comment this out, much shorter because we're only using one item, and it's a little bit of a different format. You could see up here we did get docs, and it's a query, and we're using this user reference. So it's essentially doing get docs query collection database of users where user ID equals auth.currentuser.uid. In this one down here, we're using get doc, so we need to use this doc reference, which is also imported from Firestore. And this part looks familiar. Has a database the same as up above. Let's uncomment this out again. And then the database table or the collection name of users. But you can see that we also added a auth.currentuser.uid. And so it's important to point out that when you're using get docs, it requires just 2 items to be passed through to the collection. When you're using get doc and doc, you need to have 3 items. So you can see it'll yell at you if you don't have the right amount of items if you're calling get doc. So let's try this real quick and then read data. So you can see invalid document reference. Document references must have an even number of segments, but user has 1. So this is only one segment, aka users. So now that we added auth.currentuser.uid, this will get the specific item that we're looking for. We're getting just this one line with the UID of that user ID. And then with that snapshot, we still have to do .data. So this is the function that's required specific to Firebase to turn that promise. And that's what's going on. You're getting a promise from Firestore. You're resolving that promise and setting that item to whatever you want. It's an actual object that you could use. So instead of setting update user, we're going to log it. And let's comment that out. And let's try this again. So we're going to read data, and we can see logged company, my coding school, created at, last name, Tim, and this is the specific one. It only returned 1 item this time versus before is an array of items. And this is important to point out because these are both useful. You're going to use both of these a lot. But if it's one specific user, you're going to want to use get doc because you know what that user ID is. But in my example for TrackFi, let's say I have a ton of transactions and I want to get all of them, but I only want to get them from that specific user ID. That's where you would get the get docs, and you would use a query or like, I want to get all the transactions made by this user in the last week under this category of restaurant spend, whatever it may be. So you could do those types of queries in a query up here. But in this scenario, I have, let's say, I wanted to show the user in the app itself. So we're going to call this update user. So instead of setting this to an array, we're going to set it to an object. We're going to set that snapshot.data, which is the user down here, to the user, and we're going to show user.name and user.last name. And let's call read data again. And we could see users updated Tim M. And you could add whatever you want. You could add company name. Company. And then we have Tim at my coding school. So in this scenario, it's a single user, so we only want to use get doc. Get docs wouldn't make sense here because we only want that one item. Otherwise, you would have to loop through all of them, and then the users, you would have 4 users to show. And so that is the main difference between get doc, get docs, add doc, and then set doc. And there's a lot more. There's also update doc and more complex queries, but we'll get to those in different videos. But with those 2 videos on Firestore, you could get a lot done, a lot of querying, and get the app up and running pretty quickly in those 2 videos. So hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you next time.